Good evening. I'm Chris Wallace in for Brett Baer. It must have been nice for President Trump to see a friendly face this morning. Japan's prime minister, who was the only world leader to meet with Mr. Trump before his inauguration, showed up at the White House today. The president was still stinging from his judicial rebuke last night, upholding the suspension of his immigration executive order. But he made it clear this afternoon this fight is far from over. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts begins our coverage tonight. Good evening, John.
Chris, good evening to you. Another busy day here at the White House as the president and his team try to formulate a plan to save his extreme vetting executive order. At the same time, there were hundreds of people at the White House for another visit of a foreign leader. At the White House today, a warm embrace for Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, not long after President Trump took a flamethrower to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals on Twitter, calling their ruling last night, quote, a disgraceful decision.
Thank you very much.
And at a press conference with Abe, the president pledging he will not let the courts deter him from his prime directive to keep the nation safe.
We are going to keep our country safe. We are going to do whatever is necessary to keep our country safe.
Sources say the White House may give up on the idea of lifting the temporary restraining order against the immigration ban and may not appeal the case to the Supreme Court. Instead, the White House will focus on fighting to prove the constitutionality of the ban in federal district court in Seattle.
We'll be doing something very rapidly having to do with additional security for our country. You'll be seeing that sometime next week. In addition, we will continue to go through the court process, and ultimately I have no doubt that we'll win that particular case.
The White House is also weighing the option of writing a new executive order that would create specific carve-outs for legal permanent residents and possibly visa holders already in the country that would allow them to come and go. And there are other executive orders in the works, including one that would keep the detention center at Guantanamo Bay open indefinitely. But the president appears confident he can put in place strict measures to screen immigrants.
I feel totally confident that we will have tremendous security for the people of the United States. We will be extreme vetting, which is a term that I developed early in my campaign because I saw what was happening.
The court case was a distraction as the president welcomed his second foreign leader to the White House. Security and trade were at the top of the agenda for the meeting with Shinzo Abe. President Trump making a veiled reference to one of his pet peeves, America's $70 billion trade deficit with Japan.
On the economy, we will seek a trading relationship that is free, fair, and reciprocal, benefiting both of our countries.
Abe, who spent the past 30 years in government and politics, praised President Trump's uphill battle to win the election.
This is the dynamism of democracy. I would like to celebrate and congratulate Donald being sworn in as the president.
The president reciprocated, saying after their meeting at Trump Tower in November, the two had become fast friends. The president offering Abe the rare opportunity to travel with him aboard Marine One, then Air Force One, for a working weekend getaway at the president's Mar-a-Lago club in Florida. The two leaders will conduct much of their diplomacy on the golf course after the two of them met back in November. Shinzo Abe said that he would love to come back and play golf with President Trump. So the two of them will get together for 2 rounds of golf this weekend. There will be a lot of golf course diplomacy. 1 round at the Trump National Course on Jupiter Island, another one out at the Trump International Course in West Palm Beach. And we're just hearing another development now in this whole case of the temporary restraining order. One judge from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has asked the court to vote on whether or not the temporary restraining order should be voted on or at least heard by the court en banc. That would be an 11-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. They have asked both parties, that would be Washington State and Minnesota, and the White House, to submit briefs on whether or not this should be heard. So, Chris, this thing keeps developing moment by moment.
John, and in a news cycle that never ends, I understand that President Trump is still talking about voter fraud in the November election. What can you tell us about that?
The other day, he had a group of senators, including a number of Democrats, over to the White House for a session on discussing the Supreme Court nominee, Judge Neil Gorsuch. Kelly Ayotte, the former senator from New Hampshire, who lost her bid for another term back in November, is shepherding Gorsuch around on Capitol Hill. She was here at the White House, and according to sources, the president said she would have won her seat in New Hampshire again had people not voted illegally from out of state. So the president keeping this controversy alive. We still haven't heard yet about an investigation being launched into registration voter fraud, but we should hear that soon now that Senator Jeff Sessions has been sworn in as the Attorney General. They were waiting for that, so I imagine an executive order on that front coming down soon. Chris?
John Roberts reporting on another very busy day in the Trump White House. John, thank you. One other problem that President Trump is facing in his early days on the job is a flood of leaks from within his own administration. Fox News media analyst and host of Fox's Media Buzz, Howard Kurtz, is here to talk about that tonight. Howie, are these leaks just embarrassing, or are some of them doing serious damage to the president and his team?
Chris, they are taking a toll. The Washington Post reported today that National Security Advisor Michael Flynn discussed U.S. sanctions with the Russian ambassador before President Trump took office, quote, interpreted by some senior U.S. officials as inappropriate and potentially illegal. Yesterday, Reuters quoted unnamed sources as saying that when Trump spoke to Vladimir Putin and the Russian leader raised the question of extending the New START treaty, quoting the article, Trump paused to ask his aides in an aside what the treaty was. Now, such information is so closely held, it's clear that some senior officials are deliberately trying to embarrass this president.
It seems that many of these leaks are not only targeting the president, but also top White House officials.
Well, take Sean Spicer after Melissa McCarthy played him as a hothead on Saturday Night Live, and the president did not like that. There were a spate of stories questioning whether he might be in trouble, which is mainly overheated speculation. A White House official tells me President Trump has given his press secretary positive feedback after some of his briefings. Now, some of this, Chris, is being fueled by the search for a communications director, but it was always a bit crazy for Spicer to be doing both jobs.
Who else has been on the receiving end?
Oh, you had a gusher of leaks about Steve Bannon supposedly wielding too much influence, and Reince Priebus trying to reassert control, and Michael Flynn allegedly annoying the president, and others questioning the clout of Jared Kushner. Many of these staff infighting stories seem to be driven by, let's say, conflicting agendas.
You know, and you and I have been around this town quite a while, there are leaks inside every White House. Does it seem, and of course we've only 3 weeks into this presidency, to be a bigger problem inside the Trump White House?
Sure, these leaks are par for the course, but they're usually authorized leaks that make the president look good. A front-page piece in the New York Times this week, which Trump dismissed as fiction, painted him as a lonely figure, with one telling detail about him wandering around at night in his bathrobe. That went viral when Spicer, in denouncing the story, said the president didn't wear a bathrobe, and now you have some outlets digging up pictures of him in bathrobes from decades ago. So, Chris, some of this descends to the level of silliness.
Howie, I'm going to keep you here because we are awaiting a feed. Talking about a news cycle that never ends, President Trump, we saw in John Roberts' report, was on Air Force One. He apparently took his wife Melania on a tour because she had never been on Air Force One. So he was taking her on a tour of the plane. It's pretty impressive, having been on it once myself. Took her all the way back to the rear of the plane, which is where the press sits, and basically conducted a press conference, a mini press conference about a number of the issues that came up in his press conference with Prime Minister Abe and that have come up on a number of other issues over the last few days. We are awaiting that feed. We think it's going to come in just a matter of moments. What your thoughts about that as we wait for this feed of a press gaggle that went on board Air Force One just a short time ago?
You know what struck me, Chris, is that in his press availability with the Japanese Prime Minister, Trump seemed diplomatic, unusually restrained, as he was with Theresa May. And so I had the feeling that he had more to say about some of these issues. So, of course, next opportunity he gets, he's on the plane, doesn't usually talk to reporters, but did in this case. And I think particularly he wanted to address this question of the decision, perhaps, not to appeal the appellate ruling on the travel ban.
All right. Again, we are awaiting a feed. This was coming off Air Force One. The president landed in Florida just a short time ago. Here is the president and the First Lady.
Are you comfortable?
Talk about some of what you said.
Some what?
Some of what you said in the press conference.
Sure.
You spoke about you're going to win this court battle against the immigration and travel ban.
We'll win that battle.
You also talked about
the unfortunate part is it takes time statutorily, so it takes a little time. We'll win that battle. But we also have a lot of other options, including just filing a brand new order on Monday.
Is that your plan?
Could very well be, but I like to keep I'd like to surprise you. We need speed for reasons of security, so it could very well be that we do that.
What are some of the changes that you're looking for?
Very little, just in honor of the decision. We will perhaps do that. We'll see, but on Monday or Tuesday.
You talked about new security measures. Is that separate from potentially writing a new?
We're going to have very, very strong vetting. I call it extreme vetting, and we're going to have very strong security in our country. We are going to have people come into our country that want to be here for good reasons.
What do you think of reports that General Flynn had conversations with the Russians about sanctions before you were sworn in?
I don't know about it. I haven't seen it. What report is that?
There are a number of
The Washington Post is reporting that he talked to the ambassador to Russia before you were inaugurated about sanctions, maybe trying to...
I haven't seen that. I'll look at that.
Mr. President, what is your response to the Iranian president who earlier today told people that any nation that threatens the nation of Iran is going to regret it eventually?
You better be careful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, it was a little difficult to hear all of that, but we had gotten a readout beforehand. Let me briefly recap what President Trump was saying aboard Air Force One after taking that tour with his wife Melania, turning into a mini news conference. He was asked what he is going to do about the executive order, the travel ban. He said they're considering whether to write a new one. He wants to have extreme vetting, also deciding on whether or not he's going to pursue the case in court or just write a new executive order and start from scratch on that. He was asked about a Washington Post report that we're going to tell you about in a few moments, that despite his earlier denials that National Security Advisor Michael Flynn may have talked to the Russian ambassador before they took office in December, just as President Obama was issuing tougher sanctions against Russia because of its interference in the election, that it now turns out that apparently Michael Flynn did talk, despite his earlier denials, to the Russian ambassador about those sanctions. He said he didn't know anything about that. And the last thing that he was asked about were comments by Iranian President Rouhani that Iran would defend itself. And he said they better be careful. So he was firing back at any kind of implied threat from the Iranian president. As I say, you got to be working full time to cover this president. Speaking of which, President Trump's pick to oversee the repeal and replacing of Obamacare is now on the job. Former Congressman Tom Price is sworn in today as Health and Human Services Secretary after an early morning Senate confirmation. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel tells us tonight health care is one of several big challenges for Republicans this year, and the clock is ticking.
Republicans have promised to repeal and replace Obamacare, finish tax reform, and confirm a Supreme Court justice, all big-ticket items when Washington is deeply polarized. Today, President Trump laid out his vision on improving the tax code.
We'll have an incentive-based policy, much more so than we have right now. We're working with Congress, working with Paul Ryan, working with Mitch McConnell. And I think people are going to be very, very impressed.
The ayes are 52, the nays are 47. The nomination is confirmed.
With that, the Senate confirmed the third of three cabinet nominees this week, Dr. Tom Price to lead Health and Human Services. And next week, we'll start with an agreement to vote on Steve Mnuchin for Treasury, David Shulkin for Veterans Affairs, and Linda McMahon to head the Small Business Administration.
There is nothing in Mr. Mnuchin's record to suggest that he could stand up to Wall Street.
Some GOP senators are getting frustrated with what they call obstruction.
Friends on the Democratic side of the aisle are trying to slow walk us. I mean, clearly we should have the cabinet in place by now. And under normal circumstances, we would. That would allow us to be back on the legislative calendar.
Among the other deadlines, the debt ceiling due to expire in mid-March, but can have some flexibility. Government funding is due to run out April 28th, so Congress will need to pass another continuing resolution or the 11 remaining 2017 fiscal bills. And then there's reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration, which must be signed into law by the end of September, with another goal of moving toward a next-generation aviation system added to it. and individual members of Congress have their own priorities as well.
There are a lot of things we want to work with the administration on. We want to work with the administration on infrastructure and tax reform. Just two examples. I want to work with them on a bilateral trade agreement with the United Kingdom.
The calendar gets even tighter with recesses and work periods when lawmakers are back in their home states. There's also an awareness that if Republicans falter, Democrats will be ready to pounce.
The midterm election of the incoming president and his party doesn't traditionally fare well for them. So there's a lot for us to be excited about looking forward.
House Speaker Paul Ryan has called one-party control a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But that does not mean it is easy. Chris?
Mike Emanuel reporting from Capitol Hill. Mike, thanks. Let's take a closer look now at some of the challenges President Trump faces in pushing his policy agenda. We have Fox team coverage tonight. Trish Regan in New York on what Trump tax reform might look like. But first, chief political correspondent Carl Cameron and the hurry-up on Obamacare. Good evening, Carl.
Hi, Chris. Well, this really is a milestone. The Trump administration has a new leader in their push to dismantle the Affordable Care Act.
Congratulations.
After the new Health and Human Services Secretary, Tom Price, was sworn in by the Vice President, the President suggested the repeal and replacement of Obamacare is accelerating.
We finally have our secretary, and now we get down to the final strokes.
Secretary Price has a colossal task ahead. During his confirmation hearings, he made these two promises.
What I commit to, Senator, is working with you and every single member of Congress to make certain that we have the highest quality health care and that every single American has access to affordable coverage. We will commit to making certain that they don't lose coverage under whatever replacement plan comes forward.
As a Republican congressman, Price, a physician, was one of many to author a replacement health care plan. So far, his former House colleagues have failed to find a consensus. Nonetheless, House Speaker Paul Ryan has also indicated another big step will come in less than 7 weeks.
We want to be moving our Obamacare legislation by the end of the first quarter.
The president's indicated a final replacement may not be fully implemented till next year. Some GOP senators have argued no repeal should advance without a simultaneous and superior replacement.
No one's talking about repealing anything until there is a concrete, practical alternative to offer Americans in its place.
A huge part of the looming Obamacare replacement revolves around Medicare and Medicaid. As a candidate, President Trump endorsed block granting Medicaid to the states so services could be tailored at a more local level. As a congressman, Price backed that idea too. Democrats say block granting Medicaid to the states is a dangerous abdication of a federal responsibility, and during his confirmation hearings, Price had an answer for that too.
Our commitment is to make it so that they have that coverage or greater.
That's a commitment you're making.
That's a commitment.
The last piece of the Trump administration healthcare team will be the confirmation of Seema Verda to head the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Her confirmation hearing is next week. In pushing Obamacare, the last president's commitments that health care would be cheaper and if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor were not kept. Republicans are intensely aware of that and struggling not to overpromise nor underdeliver. Chris.
Carl, thank you. And then there's what we can expect from the president's self-described big league tax reform. Fox Business Network's Trish Regan is in New York tonight. And Trish, I want to talk to you because there has been some fear in the markets that tax cuts could take a backseat to other issues like immigration. And does the market believe that President Trump will follow through on his promise to lower taxes at both the corporate and the individual level? I bring this up because markets clearly love this idea this week. Record closes all around today. The Dow gained 97. The S&P 500 was up 8. NASDAQ finished ahead 19 for the week. The Dow was up 1 percentage point. The S&P 500 gained 0.8. NASDAQ jumped 1 1/5. So, Trish, how confident are the markets Trump tax reform is going to happen?
Pretty confident. I would say the markets are very optimistic right now, Chris, which is why you've seen upside, especially over today and yesterday, because Donald Trump has described these tax cuts that should be coming forward in the next 2 or 3 weeks, the plan anyway, as, quote, phenomenal, big league, as you mentioned. And so there's a hope among traders right now that it really will surface. In other words, you will see something significant. They've wanted it forever. They have wanted this for a long time. There had been some hope with the Obama administration that at least there would be some agreement among both sides that you could get a corporate tax cut through. It didn't happen. And so now the expectation is that Donald Trump will be able to push this through. A corporate tax cut, an individual tax cut. He's promising the whole shebang here, and Wall Street really wants it.
But that leaves out the big question. Trump really wants it. Republicans in Congress really want it. But to get it through the Senate, you're going to need some Democratic buy-in. Will Congress, especially the Democrats in the Senate, follow the president's lead?
It's going to be tough because you're going to have the Elizabeth Warrens out there that are going to say, look, this is just a tax cut that's going to do nothing but enrich corporations and line the pockets of the fat cats that don't need to be lined anymore. So there's definitely going to be political pushback. The other thing to keep in mind here is that you may not see all Republicans fall in line because you have a lot of traditional conservatives that don't like the idea of spending money. And even tax cuts to a certain extent in the here and now are effectively a bit of a spend, right? Because the government's not going to get as much revenue in its pocket immediately. So they're going to be looking for some concessions in terms of other things you can cut from the budget. And right now, Donald Trump, he's really indicated he wants to do some pretty significant spending. I mean, that wall's going to cost a lot of money, Chris. The infrastructure spend that he's looking to enact, that is all going to be rather significant. So when you combine that along with the tax cuts, he may see some political pushback. He's got some work to do.
Trish Regan from Fox Business Network. Trish, thanks so much. Have a good weekend.
You bet. You too.
Up next, why some congressional Republicans are being showered with booze at town hall meetings. The early returns on President Trump are not encouraging for many Republican lawmakers taking a break from D.C. Correspondent Alicia Acuna shows us what happened when one of them met with his constituents.
A town hall meeting went sideways in conservative Utah for fifth-term Republican Congressman Jason Chaffetz.
Good question. Folks, I get one sentence in.
Jessica Priest, a political science professor at BYU, tried to attend but couldn't get in.
I think it was a combination of things, but I think a number of people were there specifically trying to pressure Jason Chaffetz to put more pressure on Donald Trump.
There is angst in Chaffetz's district, where he was last reelected with almost 3/4 of the vote. Despite his move to seek disciplinary action for Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway after she publicly promoted Ivanka Trump's products, there is concern whether, as chair of the GOP House Oversight Committee, Chaffetz will investigate potentially questionable dealings in the Trump administration.
Some of the things that I've heard, the accusations, don't step over the line.
The town hall took place in reliably Democratic Salt Lake City, a contrast from earlier in the week when Chaffetz met face-to-face with President Trump.
It was an honor to sit with the president. It doesn't happen every day. It's the first time I've ever been in the Oval Office.
The Republican from Utah is not alone in finding crowds and frustration at home. California GOP Congressman Tom McClintock had to be escorted out of a town hall meeting recently. Rowdy protesters furious over his support for President Trump's travel ban.
This country is a long, long way from any kind of kumbaya moment. The intensity, the anger, the outrage, the polarization, the political dysfunction, they're all going to continue.
If all of this looks and sounds familiar, think back to the election of President Obama in 2008. Shortly after came the birth of the Tea Party movement. Furious voters managed to replace some Republicans in Washington with more conservative ones. Chris?
Alicia, thank you. President Trump's national security advisor could be in trouble over a phone call he made before he was on the White House payroll. National security correspondent Jennifer Griffin has the latest on what the White House says was discussed in that phone call and why Democrats want an investigation.
The White House is walking back a previous denial that prior to the inauguration, the National Security Advisor, former Lieutenant General Mike Flynn, spoke to the Russian ambassador about sanctions imposed by the Obama White House as punishment for Russian interference in the U.S. election. The telephone call in question took place on December 29th, the same day that President Obama struck back at Russia and expelled 35 Russian diplomats. At the time, Flynn told Vice President Mike Pence that he had not spoken about sanctions or the easing of sanctions with Russia's ambassador, Sergei Kislyak. In turn, Vice President Pence denied publicly the Trump team had spoken with the Russian envoy about easing sanctions, which, if true, could have been a violation of the Logan Act, which bars U.S. citizens from interfering with U.S. foreign policy.
I talked to General Flynn yesterday, and the conversations that took place at that time were not in any way related to new U.S. sanctions against Russia or the expulsion of diplomats.
Today, the White House changed its tune about the denial. Flynn, quote, indicated that while he had no recollection of discussing sanctions, he couldn't be certain that the topic never came up. The revised statement came after the Washington Post and multiple news outlets reported the FBI has a transcript of the phone call, and that current and former intelligence officials say, according to that transcript, Flynn may have indicated the Trump team would relieve those sanctions once in office.
If they were talking about lifting sanctions, I can tell General Flynn and the Trump administration that there will be a violent reaction in the Congress.
Ranking Democrats on the CIA Oversight Committee have called for the White House to immediately suspend National Security Advisor Flynn and revoke access to classified information until the situation is fully investigated. Sources close to Flynn told me moments ago that he does not remember talking about sanctions with the Russian ambassador. If the conversation about sanctions did occur, Flynn didn't bring it up and made no commitments either way. What concerns them more is this information, which should be classified, is leaking out. Chris?
Jennifer, thank you. 4 people are in custody tonight in France, accused of plotting what a top official calls an imminent attack on French soil. 3 men and a 16-year-old girl were taken into custody in southern France. Police uncovered a makeshift laboratory with explosives and other ingredients for making a bomb. One official says it is believed the group was planning a suicide attack, but there is no word yet on a specific target. China was one of candidate Trump's favorite punching bags on the campaign trail, and he set Beijing off balance right after his election. But correspondent Rich Edson reports tonight from the State Department things seem to have been straightened out, at least for now.
In one phone call, President Trump diffused mounting animosity between his administration and China. And all he did was reaffirm a policy the U.S. has employed for more than 40 years.
I had a very, very good conversation, as most of you know, yesterday with the president of China. I think we are on the process of getting along very well.
The White House says, quote, the two leaders discussed numerous topics, and President Trump agreed at the request of President Xi to honor our One China policy. That policy, to establish official relations with Communist China, the United States recognized one government for China and Taiwan, the one in Beijing. As recently as December, then President-elect Trump questioned that position.
I fully understand the One China policy, but I don't know why we have to be bound by a One China policy unless we make a deal with China, having to do with other things, including trade.
And as a candidate, Mr. Trump accused China of taking advantage of the United States, unfairly manipulating its currency to boost its exports, and, as its ally, refusing to address an increasingly aggressive North Korea.
When China doesn't want to fix the problem in North Korea, we say, sorry, folks, you got to fix the problem. Because we can't continue to allow China to rape our country.
Now, with assurances the Trump administration will officially recognize only the Chinese government in Beijing, the two countries can begin discussing their differences.
This One China principle has always been the political basis for a sound, healthy China-U.S. bilateral relationship.
Now that the call has been made, that the president reinforced the One China policy, he's cleared out the major issue that the Chinese had with him, and now the Chinese have to respect him and offer something in return.
As there are direct military concerns, as China builds on contested islands in the South China Sea. And the U.S. Navy is also operating in that region. And the day before the two presidents spoke, we're also learning that a Chinese military surveillance aircraft crossed within 1,000 feet of a U.S. Navy reconnaissance plane. The Pentagon says they believe that the incident was unintentional. The White House is also saying that President Trump this afternoon has reaffirmed the administration's commitment to a U.S.-Japanese defense treaty, one that the president made clear also includes disputed islands in the East China Sea. Chris.
Rich Edson reporting from the State Department. Rich, thanks. President Trump vows to keep the country safe despite yesterday's court setback blocking his travel ban. We'll talk it over with the panel when we come right back.
we'll be doing something very rapidly having to do with additional security for our country. You'll be seeing that sometime next week. In addition, we will continue to go through the court process, and ultimately, I have no doubt that we'll win that particular case.
President Trump in a news conference today with Japan's Prime Minister taking a much more subdued tone in reacting to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision last night blocking his travel ban. Time to bring in our panel. Tim Farley of Sirius XM Radio, Matt Schlapp, contributor for The Hill, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. So, Matt, let me start with you because I think it's fair to say, I think we were all struck by this, that President Trump was very careful and much more subdued today, saying he's going to take new action next week to protect the homeland, but not telling us what it is, and that he's also going to pursue his legal options in this travel ban case. But there was no talk about so-called judges, no talk about disgraceful rulings. I guess two questions. Your thoughts about his toned-down rhetoric and your thoughts about what it is he may do next week.
Well, I like two parts about it. I like the fact that they're taking their time. He's got a lot of different ways he can go on this travel timeout. And he's going to have a lot of innings in this game to go as well. And on the legal challenge alone, there's several different paths they can take. And what I want to see is this White House have the legal team work with the national security team, the Homeland Security team, and the communications team to really roll out well the next step, because the next step, because this issue, the issue of immigration and terrorism, this is going to be the issue of the Trump presidency, and they got to get it right.
The president seemed to indicate on Air Force One that he may not pursue the case and might just write a new executive order. To some degree, that might seem to be the best way to handle this.
Yeah, or maybe not just appeal this particular ruling, maybe go through the district court level, and maybe eventually this gets solved by the Supreme Court, and maybe, like you're saying, they also come up with additional executive orders. Look, they are going to be on this issue for the next 4 years.
Charles, you said last night as we were covering the ruling as it came in that you thought that the president needed to get off this subject, and in your column today you called his travel ban stupid but legal. So is he taking your advice?
Well, he never does, so it would surprise me if he did this time. The point I wanted to make in the column was there's the moratorium and there's the vetting. The vetting will get 90% support in the country, but they actually should do it. It doesn't depend on a moratorium. The fact is they've lost the case in the most liberal circuit in the country. They've lost it at the district level, and for now the Supreme Court is deadlocked, so it's likely to return. In other words, the case is stacked against him. I happen to think it's legal, but these courts have decided not. So why play a losing hand? What he needs to do, I think, is exactly right. Either rewrite the order or have a new one, so you're dealing on a different playing field. You've gotten essentially the feedback of the Ninth Circuit, so you know what will pass muster, what won't. For example, from the beginning, you exclude the holders of green cards. And then what you do is you slow walk the appeals case and you fast walk the nomination of Gorsuch. There's no hurry on appealing this ruling. They are not going to win it in the end. Put out something else, accelerate the vetting process, announce new procedures. There's a way to keep out people from these 7 countries simply by the vetting process. They essentially have no central government. They have no information. So you can write the vetting process in a way that will honor the moratorium, even without calling a moratorium, and get the other justice on the court so that if it ever gets bumped up to the Supreme Court again, he'll win.
I'm sure they're sitting there in the White House right now taking notes on all this. You did speak a little fast, so they might want to...
That's why they have stenographers.
And they can also just replay the tape. Tim, let me switch subjects on you, and let's turn to Kellyanne Conway, because this continues to be a controversy. Going out on television yesterday from the White House briefing room, counselor to the president, and saying people should go out and buy Ivanka Trump products because some department stores were dropping her lines from the store. Sean Spicer said that she had been counseled. He wouldn't explain what that meant, but within a short time, a couple of hours, Kellyanne Conway was back with Martha McCallum here on Fox News saying that, in fact, the president supported her and very much was unhappy with any suggestion that she had been counseled. Your thoughts about all of this? Is there an ethics problem in the White House? And if so, do they get it?
I don't know about the ethics problem itself. That would have to be adjudicated by somebody else. And even Jason Chaffetz and Elijah Cummings had signed a note together. This is the chair and the Democratic leader of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and they were critical of what she had done. They wanted to look into it. I think the bigger problem is they don't have a communications director at the White House right now. This is one of the issues for them right now, is that whatever happens, they need to have a message and they need to be able to deliver it consistently. President Trump is de facto the communications director, and he's doing the job and he's doing it badly, which means that whenever anything like this comes up, they should put their heads together. When it came to doing the order, the executive order, poorly rolled out. Whenever it comes to a lot of the news that they had this week that they wanted to get out there, whether it was the new Intel factory in Chandler, Arizona, whether it was the FAA realignment, whether it was the Dodd-Frank rollout, all of these things got lost in this over-preoccupation with Kellyanne Conway, with tweets about whether or not the Nordstrom deal was a bad one for Ivanka. All of that got lost, and they just need somebody who's saying, look, let's put our heads together. Let's try to figure out exactly what message we want to get across.
Well, there may not be a communications director, but there's a lot of communication. Some would say too much, and I want to talk to you about that, Matt. Leaks. I mean, there are always leaks from a White House, and you always get one faction trying to knife the other, quite frankly. But what astonishes me is you are getting leaks of phone calls between President Trump and foreign leaders. We're finding out what President Trump said to the Australian Prime Minister. Now we're finding out what he said to Vladimir Putin.
You always have leaks, you're right, and you always have more junior White House staffers wanting to be in the know with reporters. But the leaks of these conversations, I think, are problematic. I don't know whether that leak is coming from the communications team, but I do think they have to tighten this up. This is not in the best interests of the president nor of his agenda. And look, I think he's had some great foreign policy successes over the course of the last couple of days. I think this weekend the golf summit seems to be going swimmingly. These are positive things, and I think hearing these phone calls characterized, it undermines it, and they need to tighten it up quickly.
Less than a minute, Charles. The thing, I don't think that when you're talking about leaking private phone calls, that sounds to me like it's people in the permanent government who don't approve of this president trying to embarrass him.
Well, you wonder about all the sort of the preliminary stuff involving Trump and the FBI, the CIA, the struggle he had, the battle he had with the intelligence agencies. And I've thought that some of these leaks are a way for the agencies to say, you're messing with the wrong bureaucracy, because we're the keeper of the secrets. I mean, the classic case of that, of course, J. Edgar Hoover. He had something on everybody, so he had a lot of control. But this is, I mean, this is the beginning, this is sort of the feeling out, beginning of the boxing match. But I think that Matt's right. This is really hurting the president. If you can't speak to a foreign leader without having the transcript on the front pages of the papers, then you're really hampered.
Next up, the Friday lightning round.
Lowering the overall tax burden on American business is big league. That's coming along very well. We're way ahead of schedule, I believe, and we're going to be announcing something, I would say, over the next 2 or 3 weeks that will be phenomenal.
President Trump talking up his plan for major business tax reform in a White House meeting yesterday. And we're back now with our panel for the Friday lightning round. Well, Tim, let me start with you. GOP congressional leaders were, to put it mildly, surprised by the president's announcement yesterday. They thought that they were going to be tackling Obamacare, repeal and replace first. Now suddenly tax reform is up on the front burner. What's your sense of the tax reform package that the president might put out there and chances that Congress will pass it?
Well, nobody knows what's in it, obviously, but the problem he's going to have is the Freedom Caucus, because, number one, they don't want to see any increase in spending. He's got like $30 billion increase in military spending, already talking about that, plus the fact that he's got an infrastructure project he'd like to get done. How are you going to do that with the tax reform he's talking about? Devil's in the details. To your point, Affordable Care Act has some tax elements to it. I'm not sure they want to handle any kind of major tax reform unless they get the other things done first.
Matt.
The big controversial aspect in the House plan is this border adjustment tax, which taxes imports from other countries. That'll probably be a casualty if they're really to get this bill done. The other thing is, will the tax reform bill be paid for like it was in 1986, or will it not be revenue neutral? And I think the big news could be maybe they're not going to worry so much about whether it's paid for, and that'd be a good thing.
But if you have the big spending and a tax cut that's not paid for,
you have to have economic growth. This is what George Bush 43 realized with his first round of tax cuts. He just didn't get the economic engine going, and he had to go back at it again.
Charles.
This is the one chance for a big bill that could have support on both sides of the aisle. We could have had tax reform, particularly corporate tax reform, under Obama, but he stalled it and he didn't go ahead with it. It could have been done because a lot of Democrats agreed, especially that the corporate tax structure is utterly insane. It's the worst in the world. It creates disincentives, and it is easily fixed. So that, I think, is low-hanging fruit.
The Washington Post had a story today that, contrary to previous denials, the National Security Advisor, retired General Michael Flynn, did in fact discuss sanctions in his conversations last December before he was in office with the Russian ambassador, just at the time that President Obama was imposing sanctions on Russia for its involvement in the election. General Flynn had flatly denied it, and so too, relying on him, did Vice President Pence. Here he is.
I talked to General Flynn yesterday, and the conversations that took place at that time were not in any way related to new U.S. sanctions against Russia or the expulsion of diplomats.
But now Flynn says he can't be sure that the subject didn't come up. Tim, how big a deal is this?
Channeling Howard Baker, what did he know, when did he know it, what did Michael Flynn know, and what did he say to Mike Pence? And Mike Pence, I can only imagine, would be livid about this if Mike Flynn was lying to him about this. Curious to see what he said. I think there's another problem here, and that is that some Republicans, for example, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and Marco Rubio, have introduced legislation to cut back on the president's ability to lessen sanctions on Russia. So this is an issue that could divide Republicans. The relationship with Russia is key moving forward here, and they're going to have to straighten out what's going on at home before they can move further.
Matt, Lindsey Graham said today, if it turns out that Mike Flynn was talking about easing sanctions at a time when President Obama was imposing them, it's going to be trouble.
You know, it's December after the election. The fact that the top advisor to the incoming president was talking to ambassadors and people in foreign governments, I'm okay with. I think the Logan Act charge is ridiculous. I think they always come at folks on this, and I think Mike Flynn has a target on his back, and I think he's a good and honorable man, and he's going to weather the storm.
Charles.
You go back to Watergate analogies. There's a classic case of the cover-up being worse than the crime. There is no crime. If he did it and he lied about it, that's not good. But what did he do? He spoke to the Russians about sanctions. That's his job. He's about to become the head of the NSC. He should be talking to the Russians. Why they wanted to hide it is beyond me. And the Logan Act from 1799 has never, ever been invoked, and it makes no sense whatsoever.
All right, we are beginning to run out of time, so I want a lightning round. Today, President Trump made a pivot to Asia. He met with the Prime Minister of Japan, spending the weekend with him, but perhaps more importantly, he finally talked for the first time since he became president with Chinese President Xi and backed off his equivocation on whether or not we would honor one China policy. How serious is this?
And the question is, what did he get for it, if anything? Because if he got an acknowledgement that they're going to help with North Korea, but other than that, he needs to get something going with Japan and other countries, because without the TPP, which he's already said he's undoing, then a lot of these countries might turn to Japan. But that is the question, is what was in return, if anything, in his conversation with President Xi Jinping to acknowledge the one China policy.
Matt?
A great week. Avoided a trade war with China. Relations are thawing, and a very important visit with our most important ally in the region. A great week.
If he's expecting a reward from China for reaffirming a policy that's been unchanged for half a century, then he's barking up the wrong tree. I think simply playing golf with the leader of Japan is enough to send a message to the Chinese. We've got allies in the region, and we're going to watch you carefully. And you better watch out when you militarize the South China Sea. We've got allies.
But you don't think that he got any kind of concession in return for acknowledging a policy? When he talked to me in December, right after he'd had the conversation with the Taiwanese president, indicated he was going to use this as a bargaining chip.
He doesn't have a leg to bargain on. If there were alterations in the balance of power, if we were stronger and the Chinese were weaker on the ground, in the sea, then we could impose to threaten a change in the one China policy. But the reverse has happened. The Chinese have tremendous military capacities. Ours have declined. We're in no position to dictate a change. So there was nothing offered to the Chinese, nothing given away, because we didn't have the power to do it.
Next up, the panel picks its winners and losers for this week. And we're back now with our panel to get their winners and losers of this very busy week. Tim, start us off.
Actually, in a counterintuitive way, I actually believe that it was a winning week for Donald Trump, and I would say he's the winner. Why? Because they got 3 cabinet members passed, including one that required a tie-breaking vote. He got some executive orders taken care of that didn't get challenged. And then on the Ninth Circuit Court, God forbid something happens, but he has cover in case something does happen, because he can say, I tried to keep the country safe.
And you're a loser.
The loser is the Democratic Party. Their retreat was exactly that. They are united in opposition, but they are not united in any kind of a strategy to move forward. They're moving more toward the left, which I think will damage them as they move forward. They were more to the center when they had control in 2009. They are moving in a direction that's not going to be helpful right now.
Matt.
The winner, Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society, for their brilliant approach to Trump's Supreme Court list and the rollout of Neil Gorsuch.
And your loser?
My loser? Harry Reid. Only Harry Reid could have delivered the most conservative cabinet in 50 years, because it only takes a simple majority to get these folks through. And thank you, Harry Reid, for Tom Price.
We should note, for all the talk about the nuclear option, it was Harry Reid who did it in 2013 for cabinet picks.
That's right.
Charles, winner.
It's been a stressful week, so this is the all-animal winner and losers. The winner of the week is Sonny the Red Panda, who escaped from the Norfolk, Virginia Zoo and has been living in freedom for 2.5 weeks. The loser, and I say this with sadness, is Ollie the Bobcat, who escaped from the National Zoo in D.C. and showed up 2.5 days later looking rather sheepish.
A warm and fuzzy winner and loser.
Turned herself in.
That's special report for tonight. I'm Chris Wallace in Washington. Join me this weekend for Fox News Sunday, when I'll sit down with Trump's senior policy advisor, Stephen Miller, to discuss the president's agenda. I'll also talk with the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Ben Cardin. All that on Fox News Sunday. The first 100 days with Martha McCallum.